When I moved to Ridgewood Lane in a quiet town outside Columbus, Ohio, I believed I had finally escaped the noise and trauma of my past. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened and where every house looked like it had been copied and pasted from the same template. But from the very first night, I realized something was deeply wrong with the house next door, the one owned by a man named Thomas Becker, a name I learned not from an introduction, but from whispered conversations with other neighbors who avoided eye contact whenever I asked about him. And the strangest part was that the house itself seemed alive, because every night, precisely at 2:17 a.m., I would wake up to a sound like slow breathing coming from outside my bedroom wall, a deep, wet inhale followed by a rattling exhale, and when I looked out the window, I could see the walls of Thomas's house subtly expanding and contracting, as if the building itself had lungs. And at first I blamed exhaustion or stress, until I noticed the same thing happening night after night. Always at the same time, always accompanied by a dim light flickering behind his basement windows, casting long, twitching shadows across my lawn like fingers reaching out, and I tried to ignore it until I began hearing footsteps inside my own house at the same time, slow and careful, pacing in perfect rhythm with the breathing next door. And when I checked every room, I found nothing disturbed except for faint muddy footprints leading from my back door to the wall I shared with Thomas's property, footprints that vanished right at the base of the wall, as if whoever made them had walked straight through solid concrete. And when I finally gathered the courage to confront him during the day, Thomas answered his door smiling too wide, his eyes sunken and red as if he hadn't slept in years, and before I could speak he said my full name out loud, pronouncing it perfectly even though I had never introduced myself. And he leaned closer and whispered, "It likes you," before calmly shutting the door in my face, after which the breathing grew louder, closer, and warmer, as if the air itself was exhaling against my skin at night. And one evening during a power outage, when the entire street went dark, I saw a faint glow pulsing from Thomas's basement and heard a low voice chanting from beneath the ground. Not words, but a rhythm that made my teeth ache. And when I pressed my ear against the wall, I realized the breathing wasn't coming from his house anymore. It was coming from inside the walls of my own, and panic took over as I started tearing away drywall, only to find a hidden tunnel carved through dirt and reinforced with rotting wood, leading directly into Thomas's basement, where I found dozens of photographs pinned to the wall showing every neighbor who had ever lived beside him, each photo dated, each marked with the word "fed." And in the center of the basement floor was a massive shape, beneath a stretched, translucent membrane that rose and fell with every breath, veins crawling across it like worms. And when Thomas appeared behind me, he spoke calmly, almost lovingly, explaining that the house was never meant to hold people, that it was built to contain something ancient and hungry, something that learned faces and voices, something that wore homes like skin. And as the walls began to pulse violently, the exits sealed shut, and the breathing grew so loud it drowned out my screams. I realized the truth too late. That Ridgewood Lane stayed quiet because it was always being fed, and as the lights went out and the house inhaled deeply one last time, I understood why the neighbors never stayed long and why Thomas had smiled when he said it like me. Because the house next door wasn't breathing anymore. It was learning my rhythm. I moved into a rundown duplex on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Iowa, during the winter of 2014, a place I chose only because it was cheap and far enough away from people that I could keep to myself. And for the very first day, the landlord told me something strange that I didn't fully understand until much later. He said, "The guy next door keeps to himself. You probably won't see him much." And what struck me as odd wasn't what he said, but the way he said it, like he was relieved to be passing the problem on to someone else. And the neighbor's name was Richard Lowell, a man in his late 40s according to the mailbox. But weeks went by without me ever seeing him enter or exit his home through the front door. In fact, the front door never opened at all. Dust collected thick on the handle and snow piled untouched on the steps. Yet every night, without fail, I heard movement coming from his side of the wall. Slow, dragging footsteps. Furniture scraping. Something heavy being pulled across. The floor at exactly 1:03 a.m., always the same time. And at first I thought maybe he used a back entrance, but even the backyard gate was rusted shut. And what truly unsettled me was that the sounds inside his house didn't follow any normal human routine. There were no televisions, no music, no voices, just pacing, stopping, pacing again, and sometimes a low humming that vibrated through the wall and into my bones. And one night, while taking out the trash, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The side window facing my driveway had no glass, only thick black plastic nailed over it from the inside, bulging outward slightly, as if something pressed against it regularly. And from that moment on, I began noticing other things, like the way my trash bags were always torn open the next morning with nothing missing, or how muddy footprints appeared beneath my bedroom window, even though it hadn't rained. And then there were the smells. A sickly sweet odor drifting through the vents late at night, like rot mixed with cleaning chemicals, strong enough to make my eyes water. And when I finally worked up the nerve to ask another neighbor about Richard, an elderly woman 2 houses down froze mid-sentence and told me in a trembling voice that the Lowell house had changed owners multiple times, but Richard never left, that people moved in and out around him, but he stayed. And when I asked how long he'd lived there, she said, "Longer than anyone should," and refused to say more. That same night, I woke up to the sound of scratching coming from beneath my bed, not from the floorboards, but from inside the wall, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood, stopping whenever I held my breath and resuming when I exhaled, as if whatever was doing it could hear me breathing. And that was when I noticed the small hole behind my baseboard, freshly carved, just wide enough for someone to look through. And when I shined my phone light into it, I saw an eye staring back at me, unblinking, bloodshot, too close to be humanly possible. And I screamed and backed away, only to hear Richard's voice for the first time, whispering through the wall, "I was wondering when you'd notice." And the police came after my call but found nothing, told me Richard was a recluse with no criminal history, and advised me to keep my doors locked. But the sounds got worse after that. Louder, angrier. The dragging became frantic. The humming turned into murmuring, words I couldn't understand spoken by multiple voices overlapping each other. And one night, I heard a door creak open. Not his front door, but mine, and I lay frozen as slow footsteps moved through my living room, stopping outside my bedroom, sniffing the air like an animal. And when I checked in the morning, there were wet footprints leading from my hallway into the wall I shared with Richard's house, disappearing into it the same way they'd appeared. And I finally decided to leave, packing my things and calling the landlord to tell him I was breaking the lease. But when I opened my bedroom closet to grab my suitcase, I found a narrow crawl space I'd never seen before, cut straight through into Richard's house. And against my better judgment, I crawled through it, driven by a sick need to understand, emerging into his living room where the walls were covered in old photographs of previous neighbors, dozens of them, smiling in their homes, sleeping, showering, unaware, each photo labeled with dates and times, and beneath them were handwritten notes describing habits, routines, weaknesses, and beneath the floorboards I heard movement, heavy and restless. And then Richard spoke behind me, his voice calm and tired, explaining that he didn't use the front door because the house didn't like strangers, that it needed familiarity, proximity, that it fed on people slowly by living beside them, learning them, wearing them down. And as the floor beneath us began to sink inward like soft flesh, I realized the house wasn't just connected to mine. It was growing through it. And Richard smiled sadly and said, "It's hungry again." As the walls closed in, the lights went out, and I felt the house next door pull me inside itself, breathing me in, knowing that soon someone new would move into my side of the duplex and hear the same sound at 1:03 a.m., never realizing they were listening to what was left of me. I bought my house in a quiet neighborhood outside Spokane, Washington, because it felt invisible, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened and where neighbors waved politely but never got close. And the first person to greet me was a man named Andrew Keller who lived directly across the street, a tall, thin man in his late 30s with a stiff smile and eyes that never quite focused on your face. And he stood on his porch every morning at exactly 6:40 a.m., holding a coffee mug and waving at anyone who passed, Always the same slow mechanical wave, palm out, fingers barely moving, and at first I waved back because it felt rude not to, but after a while I noticed something unsettling about it, something that made my stomach tighten because Andrew didn't wave when he saw people. He waved before they looked at him, as if he already knew they were about to glance his way, and it became a routine I tried to ignore until one morning I decided not to wave back just to see what would happen. And when I passed his house and kept my eyes forward, I still felt that familiar prickle on my neck like someone was staring holes through me. And when I dared to glance sideways, Andrew was still waving, but his smile had faded and his arm had frozen mid-motion. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me feel like I'd done something wrong. And that night, I dreamed of standing on my porch waving endlessly while something inside my house screamed for me to stop. And from that point on, the neighborhood started feeling off, like it was subtly rearranging itself when I wasn't looking, houses seeming closer together, the streetlights dimmer, the silence heavier, and Andrew's behavior escalated in ways that were small enough to dismiss, but consistent enough to gnaw at my sanity. Like how he began matching my schedule perfectly, stepping outside the exact second I opened my door, or how his porch light turned on whenever I entered a room facing the street. And then there were the notes, small folded pieces of paper left in my mailbox with no stamp, no handwriting I recognized, just short sentences written in block letters like, "You look tired today," or "Did you sleep well?" or "Sorry, I missed you last night." And I confronted him one afternoon, heart pounding, asking directly if he was leaving the notes. And Andrew looked genuinely confused before smiling softly and saying, "I don't need to write things down when I can see them." And that sentence haunted me because that night I woke up to the sound of my front door creaking open, followed by slow footsteps moving through my house with no urgency at all. And I lay frozen, listening as someone stood just outside my bedroom door, breathing calmly, patiently. And when the footsteps finally retreated, I convinced myself it was a nightmare until I found my door unlocked in the morning and a new note on my nightstand that read, "You should lock this." And I went to the police, who told me Andrew Keller had no criminal record and described him as odd but cooperative, and one officer even joked that I should be grateful for a neighbor who kept an eye on things. But things only worsened after that because Andrew stopped waving altogether. Instead, he just stood on his porch with his arms at his sides, watching, unmoving, for hours at a time, even in the rain, and I noticed that whenever he stood there, no one else was outside. No cars passed, no dogs barked, like the entire street was holding its breath. And one night, during a storm, the power went out across the neighborhood, plunging everything into darkness except for Andrew's house, which glowed softly from within like it was lit by candlelight. And when lightning flashed, I saw silhouettes moving behind his curtains, shapes that mimicked my posture exactly, standing the way I stood, tilting their heads the way I did. And that was when I realized the truth wasn't that Andrew was watching me. It was that he was practicing. And panic took over as I began packing to leave, but every box I filled reappeared empty the next morning. Items placed back exactly where they belonged, like the house itself was refusing to let me go. And when I tried to sleep at a hotel, I woke up to find Andrew sitting calmly in the chair across from my bed, smiling gently and saying, "You forgot to wave goodbye." And I ran, screaming, back to my house where I barricaded the doors and windows. But it didn't matter because Andrew was already inside, not as one person but many, his face appearing in mirrors, in windows, in the dark reflection of my television screen, all of them smiling, all of them raising their hands in that slow, familiar wave. And the final realization hit me like ice water when I looked out my front window and saw myself standing on Andrew's porch across the street, holding a coffee mug, waving in my own house at exactly 6:40 a.m., my face stiff, my smile wrong, my eyes empty, and as my body moved, without my permission, waving at the terrified person screaming inside the house I used to own, I understood what happened to Andrew Keller and everyone before him. That the neighborhood didn't kill people, it replaced them slowly, quietly, neighbor by neighbor, until no one remembered who was original anymore. And as the sun rose and I felt my mouth stretch into that same unnatural smile, I raised my hand and waved, knowing that tomorrow someone new would move in across the street, feel, watched, and wave back too late.